Good evening. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Dean. And thank you to the Nelson family for organizing and supporting such a fantastic series. And I feel really honored, actually, to be part of it. When I received this invitation, it was a beautiful event for me because I don't get to present my work much in California, believe it or not. So it's always, I take these opportunities with a lot of respect and pressure. Since I do know and understand that my work can be rather complex to grasp for a lot of people, usually, and I hope that won't be the case tonight. I sometimes do even get a question, why is this art? And it's a legitimate question many times. And I don't get, it's quite clearly sometimes more readable than an engineering project, but not always, but sometimes. And so there's a lot of different ways in each to enter the work. And as Rachel said, when I was thinking about what to talk about tonight, I have usually when I think about talks, I have two options: concentrate on a project and really go really deep into it, or try to sort of really describe a landscape or territory of activities that I and my collaborators have been involved in the last 20 years now, which is quite a long period once I start looking back, even though it seems like yesterday when this whole story started. I'm starting with this image here, which is not the Harvey Mudd College, but I guess somebody will switch me on. There you go. Of our planet. It's one that it's a data set, actually. The Blue Marble data set that NASA makes available for people to actually, use it for all kinds of visualizations about our planet. The history, of course, of the iconic image that sort of changed, supposedly. I mean, that's what writers write about. Some of you have grown up in the 60s, I see, in this audience, and have very clear memories of that period, and will probably remember the Apollo 8 picture of our planet, the first one where we actually could see the planet from far away, from the lunar sort of sphere back towards the Earth. And that was an iconic image, as far as I understand, for the whole environmental movement, but much more, right? It has a very strong philosophical sort of underpinning. So images like this are really important. Now, I always, of course, when that image appears, and this one too, this is a data set, it's a combination of the MODIS instrument, from the Terra and Aqua satellites. These are two large Earth observation satellites in polar orbit, of which data is freely available on a daily basis. The MODIS is a very beautiful instrument. As you can see, it has true color capability, and it shows us all kinds of. It's actually we can discover all kinds of things about the Earth through its instruments. Now, this data is spread around in data repositories and so on. From time to time, it would appear on a more public portal of the National Air and Space Administration. But mostly, sort of, a lot of the gems you sort of have to dig for, or alternatively, and that's where the kind of work that I do comes into play, you download it yourself from the satellite. And you get your own data set, especially with satellites that enable you to do that. And that's part of sort of the work that I've been doing. And I like to start with this one because it's sort of, it's a beautiful sort of image of the state of the planet. Another one is this. This is also a MODIS composite image of our continent that is very far away, and everybody tends to forget about it, Antarctica. And Antarctica has played a very important role in my work. And why did it play an important role? Well, first of all, because it's the opposite of the Arctic, which is the other pole that I was very interested in early on. But why I became interested in both poles was the notion that both of our poles are actually kind of sensors of our planet. If we want to understand the changes in planetary systems, they will quite surely be very much experienced at our poles in either earlier or in larger sort of amounts than in more moderate latitudes. And that's really what prompted me as an artist to start thinking about it. Of course, there's always also a personal story. And in primary school, I actually, in 4th grade, with my colleague Yuri Franceschkin, he's somewhere, maybe he will see this video, I actually planned to go to Antarctica. We actually had a very elaborate plan how we will, this was our goal, was to one day go down there. And I'm actually taking him in a few years when we will build our station. I actually met with him. And that was sort of the motivator right there. It was sort of to escape from everywhere. Me and Yuri also founded the sort of absurd society in 7th grade of the Friends of the Flat Earth. The whole idea was to sort of, to a little bit stir the debate in the geography classes and make our teacher very, very nervous. So that's where Antarctic started for me. Why that was so important? Well, we also were part of, and I explained this today in the class. We were part of we had something called technical culture societies in former Yugoslavia. This was sort of a way that the society was promoting really STEM education at the time. Of course, engineering and so on was seen as much less dangerous than any kind of political or artistic engagement. So it was very well supported. And I became a member of a ham radio club very early on when I was 9 years old, and I did my license and so on. And of course, the really incredible experience there was we had our ham radio station, our shortwave antennas and so on, and we talked to people, in Kansas, Kentucky, Washington State on a nightly basis. Not only that, also to our friends in the Soviet Union and so on. And, in the early morning hours to our friends in Japan as kids. And with really broken English at the time, but we learned it more and more. And actually, I learned a lot of my English on the ham radio rig. And this was an incredible and very, very formative experience that a sort of a piece of technology can have such kind of empowerment potential, even though, it was not presented as such. It was not presented, actually, you can talk to all these people in the West, in the East, in the North, and the South with this machine. Usually it was actually, the machines came from the army. They would donate them to the radio clubs and so on. And, they would always talk, this is, to prepare when the war starts. You guys will play a role, right? There was always that kind of Armageddon, is upon us. Sooner or later, the missiles will fly over Yugoslavia, and some of them will fall on us too. So we better get ready. And you are one of our lines of defense. But for me, looking back, of course, not then. That was really, an important sort of insight into what technology can mean very early on. So I always like to refer that period as sort of a pre-internet internet period, because the experience then when the networks really started, and I was, so-called early adopter of the internet, right? I had my first email in 1991. Clearly it was a very parallel sort of experience when that started, going on the IRC and so on. It was very similar to the ham radio world. Well, the other part of the ham radio experience that I had, which was really important, was, I learned how to build a transmitter. It's a useful task. It's a useful skill to have. But not only that, I also learned about the art of antenna making, which is an art more than a science. And thirdly, a colleague of mine who is now Dr. Vidmar, he's a professor at the University of Ljubljana, he's 10 years older than me. At the time, he was one of the early people who worked actually on the GPS clocks. This was one of his projects here in the States. He was working in Colorado. As you know, those of you who are in New Zealand, the clocks in the GPS system are really, really important for the positioning. And he was one of the students that was working on that project. And when he came back, he didn't want to stay in the States. Of course, he introduced, he was our mentor in the club. He cracked the code, it was just a code, not really encryption, of the European meteorological satellite Meteosat. At the time, you had to pay a lot of money, you had to be a governmental organization or something to be able to receive those images. And he cracked that code, and he made his own satellite receiver for receiving meteorological satellite data. And of course, 5 of us copied that receiver immediately. He published stuff online. He still has a website up where he publishes all his plans. He was sort of open source, pre-open source, definitely, and open source hardware, that is, right? In the amateur radio world, that's normal. And we all built, and we had this, 10-foot dishes on our roofs. The strange kids in Nova Gorica, there was 5 of us, and we would, I would have a Meteosat image in my room, coming down every morning, and it was just a normal thing. So how's the weather today over the Atlantic, And it was a very, very nice experience, which, nowadays is very easy. You just go online and it's there. But at the time, it was very empowering. So that all really created my universe. And once I went to high school, I learned about art. I was going to theater. I love movies, stories, music. But the art that I learned about was something completely different. Was the avant-garde of the 1920s. Was the Constructivism, suprematism. Was all of the sort of movements that really changed the art in the 20th century and also strived to change and improve society. That was a very, very utopical vision, which was extremely positive in all of these movements. And that was, again, inspiring. And, I put the two together. And that's how really my universe can be read. That's why I'm making this long introduction. Because I think it's really important to understand how I came then to the Arctic and Antarctic. Well, through the projection of utopia, of a potentiality, of the idea that you have to sort of go and understand complexity to bring sort of change back into our world, let's say. And I did all that in the beginning through the medium of performance. This was really my... as Rachel said, I studied theater and radio directing. I went to an academy and was there from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. every day for 4 years. And it was a great experience. It was a classical sort of art school. But we, of course, ended up, doing a futurist performance for our graduation work, which, that's just the way things had to be done. And immediately afterwards, I decided that the constraints of the logic of theater were too much for what I tried to create. And I started thinking about creating real ecosystems that are not simulacra, that are actually real systems, that are parallel systems that we create in the world. Not unlike, an aquarium that you have to tend to and really precisely manipulate so you have some kind of equilibrium in a very, very contained system. And it's rather complex. And that notion of the theater/aquarium was really something that was inspiring, even though it seems very, very, a simple analogy. But it was really important for me, and I did try to create those systems, and that's how I created my first performances. And to do that, it involved a lot of technology, a lot of monitoring, sensing, and, control systems. So that was the sort of path I had to take to actually be able to do all of these things. While I was doing that, something else happened. And this is the first drawing of the Macrolab, right? It was a series of projects at the time. The performances, I call them Ladomir Faktura. It's a combination of two words. Ladomir is a poem by a Russian futurist poet from 1920s, Velimir Khlebnikov, a very, very big influence. By the way, beautiful translations of his work in English by the late Paul Schmidt, published by the D. Arts Foundation, Harvard University Press. 3 huge tomes. And Khlebnikov was really, if I look at historical analogies to my work, Khlebnikov was really very, very close to that. He was an artist that was extremely inspiring. I discovered him layer through layer, first through reading the Russian originals, then the Paul Schmidt books came out. It became much more accessible to me because my Russian is not so good as my English, at least at the time it wasn't. And so it was a really, really sort of important insight. And the poem Ladomir is, again, a beautiful poem. I published a book. It's actually on my website. You can download it. With the poem, with the English translation, with the Slovenian translation. And the poem, Ladomir is a combination of two words, Lad and Mir, and in Russian. And Lad is really, it has metaphorical meanings, but one of the most important ones is sort of harmony, equilibrium. And Mir, of course, is a beautiful Russian word, which means both peace, world, but also cosmos, the universe. So it's all 3 things at the same time. But the poem is all about war. So that's, it was written just after the First World War. It's a really, really deep, sort of metaphorically extremely rich language, full of sort of insights into, the state of humanity, let's say. So that's why I love that poem, and it was very important as sort of an entrance into my world. And the other word here is factura, which is really the process that I somehow, discovered, again, in a non-existent self-analytical process that I used to understand how I perceive the process of of the process of my work, which is sort of the materialization of the immaterial, and factura of the perceived immaterial, right? And the factura is, again, a word that was in use in the Russian avant-garde, which talked about the tactile quality of painting. There's books written about factura, but the idea was that a painting actually has a tactile quality, and not one that you actually, touch the painting with, but a tactile quality that you have to sort of materialize in your thought as you look at the painting, that it has sort of a material influence on you. Of course it does, definitely a physical one, but there's others too, right, in meaning and so on. So that's why, Ladomir Faktura was this kind of combination of works. And Macrolab really happened as it's an anecdote how the project started. I actually wrote a text about it called Krk. As Rachel mentioned, the wars in Yugoslavia were a big sort of turning point for me, personally. Not because I woke up one day, also because of that, but that was processed rather quickly, and I actually woke up by a phone call. Somebody called to the apartment where I was renting, the person who was supposed to be there, and said, Lagler, that was the surname, war has started, please report here and here. I'm not Lagler, but war has started, yeah, turn on the radio. So I turned on the radio, it was 4 a.m., and it was like, okay, Slovenia is being attacked. And then I went to the store, and there was no store, there was tanks. And there was nothing. Suddenly the whole, the day before Slovenia declared independence, it secretly declared it 2 days before, but we didn't know that at the time. It was a constitutional thing. And then it was attacked the morning after the official declaration. And we had a 10-day war. It wasn't, very bad, but it was a war. 200 people died. And it sort of started the spiral, really, not started, there was armed conflict in the previous 2 years all around Yugoslavia, but it really started this very, very deadly wars in the Balkans in the beginning from 1991 to 1995, where more than 200,000 people lost their lives, and more than 1 million people were displaced. And living so close to that was a very, very strong experience. It made you do things or change things or feel very, very disempowered. It made you question, what is the role of art? What can I as an artist do in these kind of times? Do I even have any potential to change anything? And yeah, the answer was maybe, and not really yes. And it was mostly through content. So I created a project that was sort of devoted to war and to the reflection of what does this really mean for us. And secondly, in the process of the creation of that project, I was working with a colleague of mine, a performance artist from Croatia, Ivana Popovic, and she lived on an island called Krk at the time. It's the largest island in the Adriatic Sea. And it's very, very close to Bosnia, maybe 100 nautical miles by air. And one of the things that happened in 1991 when the war in Slovenia started, and you would have noticed that in this country in 2001, the airplanes disappeared from the sky, right? September 11, remember, September 12, 13, 14, no flights. Suddenly, nothing. And this was a big thing. Slovenia is really a crossroads of air traffic, and there was always planes in the air. Suddenly there was nothing. And there was nothing for 3 years. And I did that was my first art project in the museum. It was called Terminal. It was basically tracking the relief flights to and from Sarajevo and visualizing that. And so that moment, we were in the middle of this. This was 1993 spring. On this island, trying to create a performance that was supposed to be out in a very remote area, which was, strangely enough, and this is the beautiful coincidences of life, the people there call it the moon, Mjesec. And it looks a little bit like the moon because of the winds and so on. And it was early spring, and we were there discussing to do this durational performance where people would come to visit the performers, and the performers would leave out on the land for 7 days. And as we were there, it was a beautiful blue sky. There was thunder in the air, like really thunder. And you would look around, is this like an airplane going more than the speed of sound, breaking the sound barrier? No, that was not it. It was continuous, sort of, from time to time. Turns out that was the day when there was a big front opened in Bosnia, very close to this island, and the wind, the sound traveled. And we actually heard this rumble from very far away. It sounded like thunder, but it was not. And it's a weird phenomenon, right? Because of the sea and so on. Something happened. It was heard, and that really, the war sort of came back. And at that time, I decided, well, we're not going to just build, we're not going to do this performance. We're going to build a stage that we will be able to survive this war. A stage that is self-sufficient, a performance space that has its own energy supply, its own water supply, its own everything, an autonomous machine. And that's how Macrolab was born, as a stage, as a place for a performance. And as we started building the project for real, and this was my first schematic of it, and you can see there's a lot of performative elements here, But there's already, the receiving unit with a shortwave antenna system, satellite dish, satellite receivers, and an audio. So music was really important, right? This was feeding the audio, and an energy unit with solar power and wind power, and a generator, sort of a hybrid energy unit, and heating and lighting, and the transmission of all the ideas. The largest sort of part of the system is the transmitting unit, where we are sort of broadcasting whatever happens on this performance structure to the world, and it has video and texts. And these were sort of the idea for the content, right? Lectures, texts, random logic was the name of musicians that I work with. Sound composition, another colleague of mine now, an artist, Grega Tao Verhovec-Sambolis, who we still work with. Super 8 film, I loved Super 8. An animation called Microlab, which really started Macrolab. Microlab was a project I did before Macrolab. And Microlab was a real-time computer animation for the tech geeks here. Maybe you remember the Silicon Graphics Reality Engine 2 Crimson. It was the whole point of that animation was it was rendered in real time on this big machine. In those times, mostly people were just doing animation like it's done today, so it's sort of not rendered in real time, most of it, but we did that, and it was based on Vasily Kandinsky's Pictures in an Exhibition, which is the first abstract theater performance in history. So there's where theater sort of comes in. Costumes, Ivana, that was the name of the woman that we worked with at the time, Ivana Popovic, the creation artist. And, engineers, here they are, constructions of the environment, and then the metatextual basis. What is the content of this project? Avant-garde strategies, isolation, insulation strategies, war, communication strategies, sexuality, urbanity, Chlebnikov laws of time versus a real history time. So that was really how Macrolab was born. And maybe this gives you an insight a little bit into how artists are creating systems. I don't know. That's how I had to organize it for myself then and try to sell it to curators, and it wasn't an easy sell, believe me. Once I came with this piece of paper, I said, this is the project. We're going to do all this in 3 years. But we did it. And the project was realized for the first time at Documenta 10 in Kassel. And it wasn't the stage anymore, because as the development of the project progressed, we actually, realized we have to build a lot of and learn about a lot of technological systems and actually master them or invent things or sort of hack things and so on. So we had our own energy supply, we had our own water system, water purification. We produced water from seawater, not so difficult. I actually bought the machine, a reverse osmosis system for yachts, and we sort of reconfigured that, and we used that. When we were in the Venice Lagoon, that was a bit more difficult because it's so polluted, and we actually had to develop a special pre-filtering system. This is one of my favorite images of Macrolab. Macrolab is down here. This is on the island of Campalto in the middle of the Venice Lagoon, very isolated. And it's a portrait of the Macrolab from space. It's from the QuickBird satellite. And there it is. So we do these kind of things. This is another Venice. Macrolab was always also a project that developed all the time. We created many versions with the same structure, but improved it each time, right? We worked with rather bizarrely low funding for this kind of project. So we had to sort of all the time improvise, and we sort of grew the project organically through time. But in the beginning, I wrote this manifesto and decided it's going to be about 3 things, this project. Dynamic systems, the dynamic planetary systems that are computationally so complex we cannot talk about them very easily, nor in science direction, nor in the engineering direction, but really that art can really give a very good sort of insight into this, right? What is the question of what is, and here I'm citing one of my personal heroes, Stephen Hawking, the question that its answer lies 7 miles north of the North Pole. you know. And that's where sort of art comes in, really, or really, you know, the unified theory of in physics, right? So I brought students to Macrolab from UCSB. There was a lot of course, more than 100 people went through the different sort of projects when the lab traveled around the world. And people lived on the lab from 3 weeks to 2 months and worked on different kinds of projects dealing with these three global topics: telecommunications, migrations, and weather and climate. Those were the bases, and they are sort of so wide that, you know, anybody could identify with something in there, which was really, really good. But the output was a lot of, you know, communications mapping material, a lot of recordings, a lot of movies, a lot of videos, texts that people wrote, of course, stories and art projects that were started, and some scientific articles. Not much. You know, it was very difficult to persuade our science colleagues to spend more than a few days on the lab. The artists are used to the sort of residency idea, so they were easier to sort of dragoon into joining this motley crew. The lab was operating, you know, day and night, and it's a project that really created a lot of movement around itself. We, for example, one of the artists designed a probe for a balloon, for a meteorological balloon, and we launched 2 of these balloons together with the Italian Air Force with our probes on them, artist designed probes. This was long. This is now very popular. Students are doing it. Has Harvey Mudd launched a balloon yet? This is very popular lately. Everybody's launching balloons. From the experience of the lab, I just want to show a little bit of, you know, how things sort of diverged. I worked with this was one of the sponsors of Macrolab in Venice in 2003. It was a Slovenian mobile phone company, the Slovenian version of Verizon. More expensive, but everything sort of works. And they asked me to create a project for them, with them really, but for them, because they didn't know what they wanted at the time, that would basically be about digital education. And in poorer areas, in rural areas around Slovenia. So we created, with the technologies that we developed at the lab, we created this open source moving classroom in a container. And it's still there. The project is traveling around Slovenia. They, you know, like any corporation, after 5 years of being very much giving and so on, they realized, oh, let's make some money. And they turned it into a mobile telephony education zone, where, you know, you go and you learn how to use your smartphone. So it was changed from a learning environment for elderly and so on, of how to use the internet, how to get an email and so on, into but that's the nature of things. You know, corporations tend to sort of, you know, it turned out one person disappeared from the company, and then the marketing people came in and figured out, oh, why don't we make some money with this? We're just giving. Let's make some. So we lost the project completely and the control, and they painted it orange now. It's horrible. So, so we moved to Antarctica. In 2006, myself and a colleague of mine from South Africa, Thomas Mulcair, who I met when we were doing Microlab for the first time in 1997, wrote a proposal for the International Polar Year. 2007 to 2009 was the International Polar Year. It lasted really 3 years, but was called the year, which was after the geophysical year, of course, the first large and enormous sort of concentration of activities, both in the South and the North Pole. And because Macrolab always had in its, you know, we had a 10-year plan, not a 5-year plan, we had a 10-year plan, to end up in both poles, in the Arctic and the Antarctic, we proposed this project called the Interpolar Transnational Art Science Constellation, ITASC, to the International Polar Year Committee. And they it took a little bit of massaging, but they, in the end, were persuaded by the idea that artists should also have a role, and not just as a token, cultural component, but actually a role in the IPY. And that's how we started working. And our connection to the Antarctic was through the South African National Antarctic Program. They were the most open to the idea of bringing artists with them and actually working together with them. And we created this sculpture/weather station called the Groundhog Unit. Of course, Groundhog Day, it was very, but Groundhog because it was placed in a place in Antarctica called Grunehogna, which means groundhog, a mountain, but it was a nice metaphor. And the groundhog is still there. It's not transmitting data anymore because since 2010 it's not being intended to, but we intend to go back and sort of pick it up, clean it up, and so on. It's shaped as the International Standard Payload Rack, same kind of shape that is up on the International Space Station. And why is that so? Because we wanted to actually use that same shape for our Antarctic project that is not realized yet. This is Adam Height on top of the station in Antarctica. We built in the framework of that project the first Antarctic FM radio station, which is still operating there. And it's basically very loved by the whole, by the droning model and area, whoever can receive the signal, because you can actually also contribute to it and so on. It's a public radio station where you can actually upload your material and in the Antarctic zone. And these were all the nations that we brought together on our project for Antarctica. This is in the Grunehogna area. This is our plan. This was the large Vladimir Macrolab Mark 7 station that we tried to fundraise for rather difficultly. Then everything happened in 2008. The crisis happened. There was no more money for Utopia. But we're still working on this project, through different kinds of ways, and hopefully in the next 5 years we will have some units in the Antarctic. In the Arctic, we are working on a different concept, and I'll talk a little bit about it later. This is lichen, one of the inspirational organisms for our project. And this is mycelium, and this is the networks. And the networks were, of course, the ones that, and there's rather strong connections between them. And the networks were, of course, a really, really important part of what Macrolab was doing. This is the interior of the Macrolab telecommunications mapping / interception equipment, placed in a space. We activated this in the year 2000 in Brussels. Put all of the equipment in this space during a project called worldinformation.org, and sort of demonstrated. I had lectures there about encryption and digital safety and all of data safety, all of the things that people should know about and how vulnerable our communications are. Nowadays, of course, the governments, and especially our government here, is very, very actively collecting data on all of our activities. At the time, this was more sort of a warning that this could happen. Well, it happened very, very quickly afterwards, and we just demonstrated how easy it is actually to do it. And this is the way that kind of telecommunications mapping sort of then can appear in a sort of an exhibition space where, the material that was gathered here is, we have a lot of feeds from raw feeds of satellite of Saddam Hussein before the war started, 2000 to 2003, on Arabsat and so on. A lot of really interesting hours and hours of material of Saddam Hussein in his palaces, meeting people and so on. These were all Iraqi news feeds. And, this is now historical material. It's it's not, you know, probably it's destroyed where it was held at the time. The telecommunications mapping turned into performances. All of this material is part of large archives that we use. We publish this material in the form of music CDs, but also these durational performance pieces. They were called Solar, Spectre, Scatter. These are, you know, 6-hour events where we set up our electromagnetic spectrum, you know, mapping devices, and people can come and go and experience sort of the communication sphere as a real, you know, sound and visual sort of experience. And not only that, we track flights, because you can do that nowadays by sort of tracking the S-mode, ADS-B transponders, and so on. So all kinds of things connected to the electromagnetic spectrum get displayed and performed in these performance pieces. One of the ways that we try to sort of expand the notion of macrolab, and you know, it was still a lab, it was still a structure where everybody had to come to and be there to somehow be able to operate, but we had problems of how to extend its reach, right? How to understand. It was always about the understanding of the world around us, and we started thinking about how to do that. One of the ways was, well, we can connect to satellites. And we did that very, very much. And this was my connection then, which grew up into a long-term collaboration with the mostly Russian space program, was in 1997 when we were at the lab. We would talk to the cosmonauts on the Mir space station over, you know, ham radio. And Russians and some Americans too. And a friendship formed. You know, we were in a lab, they were in a lab. Everybody was bored from time to time because we were there 3 months. And we talked. They would come, we would wait for them. They would come, we would say, how's going? Oh, you know, today we actually fixed some pipes and so on. Mir was a lot of physical work. I mean, the station was pretty old at the time. There was a lot of maintenance all the time going on. So there was a very similarity. And when the first version of the Microlab was leaking, you know, it had all kinds of issues too. So it was really funny, but a friendship was formed. And a year later, I was asked by a colleague of mine that was working for a company, hey, Marko, you know, you do all this crazy stuff. Listen, we had the idea, what if we did a teleconference with the Mir space station? And for you know, an event, it was the days of digital communications, something in Slovenia. So, well, maybe. That's an idea. It's possible for sure. Let's figure it out. So I called this cosmonaut friends, oh, we'll come to Moscow tomorrow. And if you want to talk about this, of course it's possible. Let's do it. And that happened in May 1998. We actually did this live transmission from Mir and so on. And that really started a whole collaborative effort, which the next year we already did our first microgravity performance in the Russian version of the, you know, parabolic plane, which I will show you later. But this idea of sort of extending sensors from the lab was really, really important. And I started thinking about satellites. I always loved the idea since my childhood, of course. And there was a lot of amateur radio satellites that we actually used, but not Earth observation satellites. And I started working on a plan. This is, you know, the project, LADSAT, you know, Vladimir satellite. It's not a realized project, but it's sort of, I dived deep into space engineering at the time. And that was really, really important because of the things that happened afterwards. From 2002 to 2008, we started a campaign called MIR, Microgravity Interdisciplinary Research. And it was a campaign to bring artists and scientists together to work on projects in parabolic flights in Russia. And this we did with all kinds of strange European Union funding and sponsorship and so on. And we did 10 flights altogether during the MIR campaign. I was flight director of those flights. And a lot of work came out of that. A lot of these films are online and so on. The first performance we did was in 1999. This is the performance in the microgravity laboratory, the Ilyushin 76 MDK, was called Biomechanika Nordung. In Slovenia, we have the director of this performance was Dragan Živadinov. He's a Slovenian avant-garde theater director and who has very, very strong connections to space because of the Nordung myth. Does anybody know who Herman Potočnik Nordung was here in the room? Well, the Potočnik part, maybe. Herman Nordung. Well, he was one of the early space pioneers. He wrote a book, The Problem of Travel in Space, the Rocket Motor, and published it in 1929. This is the book that was then cited by Werner von Braun in his graduation work. And it was basically, the predecessors were just Goddard and Obert, really. And Nordung was the first one, he was Slovenian. The man, of course, was very unknown at the time, but the people who knew, and actually translations of Nordung appeared in nothing else than Amazing Stories magazine in early 30s in America. As, Captain Nordung's writings about traveling in space, because he had these elaborate drawings in there. And Nordung's book was then translated into Russian in 1933. And he was the first one to calculate the geostationary orbit, Nordung was. He wanted to place a space station in a geostationary orbit. And Arthur C. Clarke, the third quote in his Wireless World article from 1946 about extraterrestrial relays, which established the notion of, the idea of geostationary communication satellites, is from Herman Potočnik Nordung, because he actually calculated the orbit. So it's more a Nordung orbit than a Clarke orbit, but, later on, because this was an obscure character, nobody knew about this engineer, even though he published this book. And we learned about him only first in the late 60s, but I didn't, of course, when the whole moon thing happened. There was some people who knew about this in Slovenia and published articles in local newspapers about this Slovenian space pioneer from the 20s. Then it was silent. And then in 1986, the translation appeared in Slovenia of the book, The Problem of Travel in Space, the Rocket Motor. And as kids, hey, you look at this, Slovenian guy wrote a book about travel in space in 1929. How good is that? So it was really inspirational, and Dragan created his whole theater around this mythical character of Nordung. And this was the performing space in the actual airplane, and you saw later the actual performance. I could talk for 2 more hours, but I won't, because I see a lot of tired faces here. I will have to slowly conclude, and I will conclude since, I haven't even started talking about the Arctic. I did talk a little bit about the Antarctic. I'll come to the Arctic, but the part of my lecture was also about the war, and I talked a little bit about the war. But one way I approached it, and this is a project about the genocide in Srebrenica that I just finished 2 years ago, and it's basically an Air Kive about the genocide, but it's also a data mapping project about it. I used a scripting software that AT&T developed in the early 80s to map their networks, to basically figure out how you can create a network map. It's scripting language. And I used that scripting software to actually map the telecommunications during the genocide operations. So in July 1995, the town of Srebrenica was attacked by Serb forces, and 8,000 people were killed in a matter of 7 days, and executed. And it was an incredible, of course, historical event for our part of the world. But also, for me, it was very interesting to look at how genocide happens sort of in the electromagnetic sphere. Because there was all this data available. On one side, from the International Criminal Court for the war crimes in former Yugoslavia, and on the other side, through my interviews with the intercept operators in Bosnia. It was a long research project. I got the insight of how they actually eavesdropped on these communications, and I created a map of communications of the attacking forces during the actual operation, and all that data is then presented in this installation. So, and it's basically, this is in this room that you see here. That's what's inside. And this is the Air Kive, all of the maps, maps of the area, tactical piloted charts. So you really try to, it's again sort of a revealing of sort of unknown and hidden things behind genocide. And this is one of the projects that I really, really, care for. And I've been very much involved in it and with the whole Srebrenica situation. Why? Because, of course, it's one of those points in life where you say, well, this cannot repeat anymore. So let's make sure everybody understands it as deeply as possible on all sides. And that's what that project is about. This is very quickly, it's another, since the topic is art and science, this is my most art science project lately called Polar M Mirrored. It's basically a large observatorium for charged particles. That's what it is. Ionizing radiation. We have Geiger counters, granite radiation generators, and the whole system is basically autonomously driven by these random events. And there's a cloud chamber, there's a camera on the cloud chamber that is analyzing what's happening with the particles, and it drives the whole sort of environment. And I'll show you a video. We have still some time, right? 15 minutes. Or more like 5. Okay, perfect. So I'll show this video. Because we want to leave some time for questions, right? The Polar M video. So you get an idea of how this project looked like. A little bit. It's a project that you, of course, have to experience. I created this with a large group of engineers and a colleague of mine, an artist from Germany called Carsten Nicolai. I hope my network is on. But maybe not. Oh yeah. The behavior of the robot is connected to the particles it detects. It's all a very autonomous system, and that's why the project is called Polar Mirrored, because we have two spaces that are completely the same, mirrored. One you can enter, the other one you cannot. And we are, of course, asking the questions, are these two spaces the same space or not? There can be obvious and less obvious answers about that, right? So in a lot of my works, autonomy is very, very important. Where were we here? And after Polar, I come to the Arctic, really. The Arctic is the other sort of space of engagement of my work, as it was mentioned before. for the difference between the Arctic and Antarctic, there's many. The Arctic is an ocean mostly, with land mass around it, and the Antarctic is, of course, a continent. But the other difference, of course, is the Arctic is populated with a lot of indigenous cultures, and the Antarctic is not. It's populated by the indigenous cultures of scientists and some tourists, and a very, very few artists. So it's a very, very different place culturally. And that's what really prompted also me and my colleagues to concentrate on the Arctic, because we felt that it's really the place where projects like ours can really, start creating a lot of movement. There's other projects in the Arctic that are doing the same. So we are part of one large sort of story. This is, for example, a Chinese iron ore exploration site in the Arctic, in Canada, actually. And that's what the Arctic is all about nowadays. It's about going there and trying to sort of monetize it in all kinds of ways. But the people there are not very happy about that, obviously, for many, many reasons, historically too, because, if we're talking about slow genocides and so on, the Arctic is a typical example how sort of our white culture goes there and destroys everything in its wake, almost. In the Soviet Union, they did it already in the 30s, in this country and in Canada in the 40s and 50s, and the damage was done, and now, the people are really suffering for it, and it's a very, very resilient culture. So we have as much to learn from them as maybe they can potentially, maybe sometimes learn from us. And our Arctic projects, they're complex. I won't go into their details. It's too much. It would be its own lecture, really. But you can find a lot about them on the website, arcticperspective.org. And we published books there. But really, they're about the engagement with the local Arctic populations and, again, using technology as an empowerment tool, where technology can really sort of bring, change or empower the local population to do things that they were not able to do like before. For example, using a hacked satellite connection to have internet and email in the Arctic. That's one of the things we did, and this was our makeshift workplace in the Arctic. But most importantly, we also have workshops for media development, free open source software, how to use open source software to create movies and so on, and all kinds of things like that. And we create systems. This is our Arctic power system, which we use also in the Antarctic, hydroponic gardens, and the unmanned aerial vehicles. That's the UAVs is something that was created from Macrolab, from the wish to sort of be able to deploy sensors far away from the lab itself. We perfected that to a level where we now actually have very, very powerful unmanned aerial vehicle system. It's called the Bramor. It was developed through a research project in the end with substantial funding, and it's now actually being produced as a UAV. And it uses a Lockheed Martin autopilot also. So, but we are able to create instant maps like this one of the city of Iglulik, or this one of our campsite in Ikpik. And it's really an amazing tool, and we are using it more and more for all kinds of projects, because nowadays you can really do a lot with this data. And I won't go into my satellite world now because there's not enough time, but remote sensing was the logical sort of thing to tackle through when we started using the unmanned aerial vehicle. It was clearly that there is a lack in our team of remote sensing and GIS knowledge. And that was developed, had to be developed. And through that connection, we started working also with engineers and scientists in Slovenia in developing the first remote sensing satellite. And it's a project that is ongoing, and we've done a lot of work with so-called interactive remote sensing. This is, for example, a formation flying experiment that was done just in 2012 in May. And this picture is taken from a smaller satellite looking down over Slovenia at this other satellite, and they were flying information over Slovenia. We also, this was my work to develop a ground control station. Actually, I went down to Poway here in California, and we commissioned a corporation here, C-Space. We bought their equipment and set up this large ground control station that is going to have access from here. And if there's interest at Harvey College for the students to be able to connect and download and control a ground control dish in Europe, talk to me. We are planning a whole open infrastructure around that, where we'll be able to download data from satellites remotely with this system that we have set up. The other project I'm working on, and I'll conclude here, is together with Matthew Biederman and a group of my students at UCSB. It's called Sinuni. It's in Inuktitut, Silamilu, Nunamulu, Nipriuti. It means land and climate recording device. And it's a sensor network for the Arctic, used by the people. It's an automated mesh networking infrastructure, and it's really for environmental monitoring and audio data recording, and it's a very rugged system. These are the different prototypes that were built in our lab up in Santa Barbara. And just this next week, we are going to the north, to the Arctic again, almost in the middle of the winter, to test this system in Lapland, in northern Finland, with the people there. This is another piece of technology that we developed. It's called the CDPDU, Common Data Processing and Display Unit. And it's a portable remote sensing, processing, and display station. And it again came out of a need, right? We were out on the land, and how do you even communicate the remote sensing data to the people or show it around and so on? So there was no way to do it on a small screen, and we sort of figure out and built one with a large, very powerful computer for processing that connects to our power system, and we can sort of carry this thing around. And the ultimate Arctic project is the Kalitak, the Thunder, which is a mobile Kamutik sled, which has all of this equipment inside, and people can go out on the land for very long periods of time and actually use all this data, process the data, deploy this sensor network, and that's what we are working on at the moment. So autonomy through technology. And this is all of the Arctic autonomous regions flags. Okay, thank you.